emérito da Universidade Central da Europa, em Viena. Ele nasceu na Algéria, estudou filosofia na Escola Normal Superior de Paris e na Escola de Altos Estudos e Ciências Sociais em Paris. E foi professor de secundário e depois fez o concurso de agregação. E, a partir de 88, ele foi diretor de assuntos culturais da Córcega, de cuja família ele é oriundo. Ele vai falar algo em córcego, vocês vão ver que é muito parecido com o português, misturado com o espanhol, com o latim. E, então, ele foi eleito professor da Escola de Altos Estudos de Ciências Sociais de Paris, onde completou sua carreira, e depois foi também professor em Budapeste e em Viena. Ele é membro da Academia Europeia, fellow, né? Professor agregado do Instituto de Estudos Avançados de Berlim e do Instituto de Estudos Avançados de Princeton, Estados Unidos. É autor de quase 20 livros, vou apenas citar alguns. Après la culture légitime, a partir da cultura legítima, Éducation populaire et le théâtre, Educação Popular e o Teatro, Pierre Bourdieu, um estruturalismo heroique, Pierre Bourdieu, um estruturalismo heróico, que eu recomendo, um belíssimo livro. Sociologia da Córcega, um outro que eu recomendo, Incluindo, e, mais recente, a Sociologia, História, Ideias e Correntes. O professor Júlio Fabiani é um estudioso da teoria sociológica, um produtor de teoria sociológica, com esta visão cosmopolita, e é um grande prazer recebê-lo. Ele vai falar em inglês, com tradução, vocês têm aí os fones. As perguntas também poderão ser feitas em qualquer língua, de preferência em inglês, português, espanhol, francês ou córcego.
Muito obrigado, José Vicente. Muito obrigado pelo convite. É uma grande honra estar aqui com vocês hoje. No passado, apresentei pesquisas, trabalhos na SBS e apreciei a fecundidade dos nossos debates, se assim posso dizer, a alegria da sociologia. Now I will speak English, and I would like to apologize for this. Okay, so thank you for inviting me. I have been working in the sociology of environment since the mid-70s, so it's 50 years ago. At the time, it was far from being a fashionable topic. In France, my supervisor, orientador, Pierre Bourdieu, was quite skeptical about it. Now it's a major issue, a matter of survival in the short term. However, the situation of the Earth is continuously worsening, and there seems to be no way of improvement, particularly since the re-election of Donald Trump. Let me begin by my own trajectory. When I was a PhD student, I was interested in the swift changes in French rural society, what my mentor Jean-Claude Chambourdon called the urban uses of rural space. How the decline of traditional agricultural practice gave way to, on the one hand, to a highly polluting capitalistic agriculture, and, on the other hand, a bunch of new leisure activities inducing an increased competition for space. At that time, the first ecologist activists fought against rural hunters who were considered as a danger for ecosystems. We try to analyze in our fieldwork their practice in a more objective way. Their indigenous or local knowledge prevented them from predating an excessive quantity of game, and new agriculture was much more damaging for the wild fauna due to the disappearance of vegetal edges and the use of pesticides. Our articles were not received very positively 40 years ago, especially by the ecologists. Our work has been recently revisited and rediscovered by young French anthropologists, particularly Charles Stepanov, who confirmed our insights and our data. This means for me that blind activism is useless and that we need to accumulate empirical research if we want to make progress in our understanding of the situation. In my presentation, I will try to keep under control the huge ideological bias that plagues our conversation on environment and contribute to the issue of the ecological urgency in rational terms. I will develop 3 points. The first is a rationalist claim. It's never too late to be a rationalist. And you will be maybe surprised or disagree, but I'm looking for disagreement and a controversy. The second is a direct consequence of my own experience as a researcher and my frustration related to the paradoxes of what I call middle class ecologism, a middle class illusion. And I will be maybe a little bit polemical at this level. Something should unite us. Our house is burning and we are looking away, said the president of Chirac of France long ago, but he looked away too. So this illusion of the middle class will lead me to examine what I call the quarrel of the new ancient and the false moderns, title of my third point. And my third part will be about apathy and denial. Why are we so apathetic and deny the issue despite my first slide was about the forest fires in Canada, despite that we can experience the forest fires all over Europe. The fires in Canada, of course, with gray skies and smoke. My conclusive part will try to envisage possible ways to use the planet in a smart way. Andreas Malm, the Swedish thinker who supports violent activism, once said, "We need more Lenin and less Latour." Is he right? Is he wrong? Is the opposition, as I think, totally pointless? We will see that in my last part, titled, of course, "What's to be done?" And I will not answer about what's to be done because I have not the means to do it. Okay. So, it's never too late, maybe with a question mark. It's never too late to be a rationalist if we consider that reason does not belong to a province of the world, namely Europe, but must be constructed as a universal tool. The situation of the planet forces us to be universal, and there is no time left. Besides, capitalism is not the consequence of a rational plan, of the rationalization of society. As the great historian of Chicago, Kenneth Pomeranz, showed in his book, Great Divergence, capitalism largely developed in a contingent way and is based on the foolish idea of a natural cornucopia. And Donald Trump still believes in cornucopia when he says drill, baby, drill. I do not mean that the old-fashioned universal as an abusive generalization of some particularism is at stake here. It's a new form of universal. In his famous comment on Kant's, Immanuel Kant's, Was ist Aufklärung, Michel Foucault considers that the debate for or against the Enlightenment, which has been so important in decolonial theory, Foucault said this debate has no meaning as such, and he called for a new space of inquiry that would take into account our own determination as subjects by the Enlightenment, making it the object of a new history still to be written, okay? And this is important. Although this short text has been quoted over and over, it is still a sort of an empty program that does not overcome the antinomies of modern rationality. I would like to draw on Foucault's most suggestive remarks, albeit in some ways enigmatic. I quote Foucault here, "Many things in our experience convince us that the historical event of the Enlightenment did not make us mature adults and we have not reached that stage yet, end of quote. The very idea of a cosmopolis in Kantian terms involved a gross oversimplification of the notion of the natural and social order. Three principles illustrate its shortcomings: the taste for homologies, which is a way of popularizing the mathesis universalis, the imperialism of unilinearity, so obvious in the variable-based social sciences, one of the strongest legacy of the Enlightenment. And finally, the hypostasis of abstract universality, which appears most of the time now as local visions mistaken for universal statements. Perhaps the most convincing element in the list is the idea of universalism as dominant localism in disguise. We, the French people, and I apologize for that, we know this too well, as colonization French style was the direct and explicit consequence of a desire to bring French universalism, which is a contradiction in terms, to the world. The Parti coloniste, the colonist party, that advocated the conquest of the primitive regions of the world in the name of the civilizing duty of the Republic, it was named like that, was crowded with enlightened and secularized intellectuals who believed that their claims were directly derived from the Lumière, the Enlightenment. Jules Ferry, the Minister of Public Instruction, a lot of high schools, lycées are named after him, still today in France, who brought in the free and mandatory primary school education, was one of the main theoreticians of the colonizing process, seeing it as a part of the same project as that of educational development in France. But in the colonies, the educational system was not created. So the identification of the colonizing process with the civilizing process, as Elias would have put it, was a major feature of the Third Republic and contributes to an explanation of the huge difficulties that France faced at the time of decolonization, and I would add, still faces. Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe, Post-Colonial Thought and Historical Difference was undoubtedly a shock for all of us, published 25 years ago, in 2000. This book remains the seminal text in post-colonial studies, which seeks to examine how Western intellectual history continues to shape the agendas and expectations of less developed countries or developing countries. Chakrabarty argued that Western theories are both indispensable and inadequate. And the real difficult term is indispensable. And it's more tricky than other decolonial type of thought, of course. The author, Chakrabarty, criticized the evolutionary model through which all societies would pass, which also happened to be the very contingent, as I told you before, of the European pattern. Western social theorists did not take religion seriously, even Marx, just as they took for granted the use of Marxist concepts to account for the class consciousness of Indian workers. Chakrabarty dismantled the Eurocentrism that runs through Western social science, and of course, it's centered around Europe. Europe is much more than a geographical region. According to Chakrabarty, it's a body of knowledge that defines how we should see the whole world. We can accept Chakrabarty's claim. However, in his more recent work about climate change, and I come to my issue, Chakrabarty does not seem quite different from the late French thinker Bruno Latour, who was a very good friend, a thinker who situated himself in the legacy of a non-rationalist but strongly European and Catholic type of epistemology. The Indian historian even quotes Carl Schmitt, especially the nomos of the earth, very positively, an unlikely decolonial reference, but a quite conservative one. Schmitt was a Nazi, as you know. According to Schmitt, the idealistic universalist political project inherited from the French Revolution and the Enlightenment seems absurd, turning what the author refers to as Hellenistic philosophical generalizations of the polis as a cosmopolis into a concrete ambition. And Schmitt adds that, I quote, they were devoid of topos, that's location, and therefore did not constitute a concrete order. End of quote. One can find in the nomos of the earth a critique of Western civilization based on its confusion between the law as nomos, a rooted concrete order, and the law as gesetz, a rule, pure and simple. The nomos is based on appropriation. This naturally leads us, according to the German legal scholar and philosopher, to believe that any political project expressed merely in law as a rule, the rule of law, which is at no point anchored in terra firma, and the realities it imposes is suspect. We have to suspect the rule of law. It seems that Chakrabarty considers that postcolonial thinking can appropriate itself Schmitt's reasoning, as if it were a critique of imperialism or economic domination, which is, to me, very dubious. Being an anti-modern does not imply a postmodern or post-Eurocentric standpoint. Far from it. The Indian historian writes, Schmitt tells a story of how the idea of law got dislodged from its association with earth, understood as land and dwelling, when the sea opened up to an expanding and imperial Europe, end of quote. This reading clearly shows the appropriation of European most conservative thought by the most brilliant analyst of the limitations of the European mode of thinking as such. This creates for me, and I don't know for you, but a kind of epistemic insecurity. In the same vein, Heidegger's debunking of planetary imperialism should not be assimilated with a form of ecological thinking emerging from the global south. For a European after the collapse of Europe, Europe does not exist any longer and will not be saved by the European Union. So for a European, if I may say, who is, as my orientador Pierre Bourdieu was tired of his maleness, beings to be tired of her or his conceptual Europeanness, this is quite disturbing. Being provincialized seems to be a too slow process. We would love to see even less Europe in the new thinking, but clearly it's not really the time of these changes. So I will now come to this part that will maybe engage into a discussion and a lack of consensus, which is a part of my work a long time about the question, middle class illusion, what it is. Here I see, you can see where I lived for many years near Marseille. This is in Martigues, 40 kilometers west from Marseille, it's on the Bear Lake. And this is the Quai Poterne, where, and more precisely, the miroir aux oiseaux, the bird's mirror. And it has been painted by Impressionists, and it's well known, but it's a popular area where I lived. This is a communist city. It has remained communist even after the decline of the Communist Party, which means it's a working class city, a lot of chemical plants and so on around the lake. And this is, of course, the example I will use. Injunctive forms that call for new practices are part of the long history of the domestication of the working classes. Bad practices must be abandoned in favor of behaviors governed by moral requirements and a sense of responsibility that is supposed to be lacking in populations unfamiliar with this type of discourse. One thinks, of course, of hygienism, of which environmentalism is in some ways an extension. Ecology is based on the discipline of the body that is less concerned with the intensity of consumption than with its formal character. For example, recreational boating in the Marseille region, which relies on small motorboats, what we call the pointus, the sharps, or the barquette, is very often stigmatized for its polluting and predatory nature, while bourgeois sailboating is considered as an ecological sport where only renewable resources are used and where a whole range of aesthetic sensations develop, a true synesthesia with nature. It matters little that the carbon footprint is rather unfavorable for the latter, as the former spend more time repairing their boats, the working class retired people most of the time, repairing their boats than going out to sea, and rarely venture more than 100 meters from the shore. On the other hand, the environmental cost of sailing, the existence, this is Jeff Bezos' yacht that we were so happy to welcome in Venice 2 weeks ago. 125 meters, I think. So the cost of sailing with a yacht, with sails, existence of big engines, sport facilities, towing, and so on, crew, and is readily underestimated. In my region of Corsica, if you make a circle between Corsica and Sardinia, the sister island, the Isola Sorella, you find more than 50% of the big yacht of the world, the fleet, that is in the Caribbean in the winter. Here we find Pierre Bourdieu's distinction. Lifestyle, morality, and knowledge form an inseparable whole that allows social groups to be recognized according to their relationship with nature and valued accordingly. Ignorance and predation are associated. It generates the joint development of aesthetic disgust and moral indignation. The example that I have worked a lot in the past of popular hunting is an old one, but it sheds light on the social functions of the aestheticization and moralization of the relationship with nature. One need only look at the changes in hunting practices in France since Jean-Claude Chambourdon and I described them some 30 years ago. There has been a drastic reduction in the number of hunters, the elimination of a significant proportion of practitioners from the working classes who are condemned in advance as gros cons, big jerks, and a tendency toward the generalization of hunting as a luxury leisure activity. The moral of the story could be told as follows. Members of the middle classes were campaigning without being fully aware of it for what Chambourdon called the becoming park of nature, are working to eliminate the working classes from rural areas for the benefit of the upper classes who intend to reserve for themselves a monopoly of hunting violence on the grounds that they alone can exercise it with style, or to put it more sociologically, with Elias, that they have succeeded in stylizing violence and neutralizing predation. The middle classes enthusiastically discover outdoor leisure activities, an interesting concept which differentiates them from sports practiced in dedicated venues within associations, closer to what the popular classes engaged in. The environmental impact of these activities compared to hunting in communal societies is rarely questioned. These people are embracing a capitalist hedonism that is, of course, centered around consumption. Ecological modernization can be seen at the culmination of the dissociation between, on the one hand, an activist form of ecology, which, with varying degrees of radicalism, has made the environmental issue a public concern and has therefore been the main vehicle for its institutionalization, and on the other hand, an expert form, which has sought to depoliticize the issue and make it compatible with techno-bureaucratic modes of management capable of legitimizing its expertise. During this process, the capitalist mode of production ceased to be seen as the cause of the depletion of natural resources. Instead, poor production techniques were blamed for the problems. Environmental expertise made it possible to remedy the misuse of resources. Production can continue, but in a different way, within the framework of a capitalism informed by science. However, such technological optimism is not entirely free from the moral imperative that constitutes political ecology, but it does take this into account in the construction of its founding principle. How can we conceive of a new productive order if it is not accompanied by a moral transformation of producers and consumers? Ecological modernization is indeed a complex mixture of expert knowledge, moral imperative, and aesthetic choice that constitutes the ideology of ecology today. The instant success of never truly clarified concepts such as sustainable development or the equally rapid greening of polluting industries has been little questioned, as the change in vocabulary, arguably more than in practices, was quickly taken for granted. Environmentalist discourse has moved from the fringes of active minorities to the mainstream, built around a corrosive critique of knowledge institutions and industrial practices. It has become their best lubricant. Today, the contrast between the success of the environment as a narrative and the state of the planet is striking. I come now to my part on the quarrel of the new ancient and the false moderns. And again, I will question a little bit the doxa of ecology. In his great book, An Inquiry in the Modes of Existence, Bruno Latour seeks to close what he calls the modernist parenthesis, that brief moment in human history or in the history of the Earth, Gaia, which might be more appropriate. This modern parenthesis has to be closed. The environmental crisis provides an opportunity for this shift in that it reveals, perhaps for the first time, the dead ends of modernity. The exhaustion of explanatory models in the social science is another sign of the weakening of something like, I would call it like Elias, a configuration that is never really described by Latour, no doubt because if we were to attempt to describe it, we would be led to use the usual tools of the social science. Form of accumulation would be identified, as well as the logic of the empowerment of social groups, scholars, intellectuals, and so on. This is not Bruno Latour's objective. The moderns, people, the moderns, much more than modernity, have long occupied a central yet obscure place in the vast construct he has presented to us. What can be said is that they do not play a favorable role in history. So who are the moderns? A temporal marker appears in Latour's work, albeit rarely and fleetingly, the 17th century. We think we recognize, but it's never very clear, modern science, rationalism, the Enlightenment, the social sciences, secularization, and the primacy of the economy. Names circulate: David Hume, Voltaire, Kant, Durkheim, Weber, without ever surfacing the idea of mastery and possession of nature, okay? Master and possessors of nature, it was Descartes' motto in the 17th century. This idea of mastery and possession seems likely to account for this interlude in the history of the earth. The notion of a court of reason, okay, a court, a supreme court of reason, is more present in Latour's work. Rationalism seems to have crushed the other modes of existence that Latour patiently enumerates in his book, in particular through its insistence of producing and activating the accusatory category of irrationality. The illusion, and this for me has been a little bit troubling from the start, and I told Bruno many times, the illusion of emancipation is also an indicator of the presence of the modern, revealed, on the contrary, by the need to multiply attachments to non-humans. And Bruno said, the end of emancipation is the only possible destiny. Above all, the central opposition that defines modernity is that which distinguishes nature from society. There is, therefore, a clear homology between the type of science studies that Latour developed early in his career, in which he contested the cognitive effects of the split between nature and society, and the metaphysical and political constructions that he has presented more recently. The studies on science were a propedeutic to the broader undertaking that concerns all modes of existence. We can define the modern as the opposite of ecology. This is even the most precise definition offered to us. In everything that follows, the term modernization and moderns are opposed to ecology. Between modernizing and greening, we must choose. In their determination to distinguish themselves from nature at all costs, to make emancipation a political project, we still live on in many ways. Modern people are undoubtedly guilty of hybris. Their pretension is evident in what has been the program of the social sciences, the hypothesis of society as the only form of association limited to human, the development of a program of rationalization, the desire for emancipation, critical theory that it does not like. Beneath the apparent seriousness of this epistemological political program, Bruno Latour identifies something like a joke. He intends to offer a realistic description of what modernity has been, and I quote him again, by finding a standard that is no longer fanciful, the advent of reason, end of quote. So this sort of hostility to reason that I do not share and will never. How does Bruno Latour justify his own appearance on the argumentative scene or stage? He arrived at a specific moment in history, that of environmental urgency. In this sense, he is a child of global warming. The recognition of the diversity of modes of existence appears in the form of an ontological plurality that puts the ambition of social science back in its rightful place. The mode of knowledge it has promoted must only be detached from the discourse of modernity, of which it is only one militant form, a militant form of rationalization, and conform to the methodological requirements of a new science of assemblages. You know that. It must be also confronted with other modes of existence that establish types of veridiction and conditions of happiness and unhappiness, in the sense given to them by the pragmatics of speech acts, a discipline widely referred to in the book, that are completely different and therefore likely to come into conflict, hence the need to give a central role to the work of diplomats. I will leave aside here the power of religious reference, particularly Catholicism. For an anthropologist who seeks to put Western modernity in its place, that of a parenthesis, the privilege thus granted without question to a regional religion would be the subject of sociological inquiry. Latour deliberately chooses to ignore the dimension of cultural arbitrariness implied by his reference to Catholicism, or to Christianity more broadly. What would an investigation into ways of life whose narrative framework was provided by a reference to Islam or Buddhism reveal? The question is far from incongruous for an anthropologist and a sociologist. It even appears to be a prerequisite for any anthropology. Latour has courageously announced something like the twilight of the classical social sciences, and we wanted to go some way with him. However, if we agree to give more space to actors and networks, if we can recognize ourselves in some of his ethnographic proposals, must we therefore renounce the reflexive ambition that characterizes the project of social science and which by definition prohibits any form of prophecy? Latour, and he told me that quite a few times, would respond that this objection is the proof that we remain prisoners of the modernist parenthesis. I want to be emancipated. You say, yeah, you are an old Marxist and so on. We can agree with Carcenti, Bruno Carcenti, the French philosopher, that the self-instaurative dimension of the enterprise is more important than its restorative dimension, the conservative one. Okay. Latour is perhaps less anti-modern than he believes. The diplomacy of modes of existence, of which he is the herald and organizer, can be seen as a new form of democracy based on the capabilities of a social science, finally freed from its hybris and ready to contribute to the investigation of values and the endless negotiation of the common good. Sociology would finally be in the place Durkheim had assigned it, the science of new institutions. Here, I vote Latour against Malm because I don't think that an ecological Leninist dictatorship would work. And now, I am approaching the end, apathy and denial. Apathy and denial. Here, I will use Karen Norgaard's useful definition of apathy and denial in her book, which is more than about 15 years old, but which is still very, very interesting, Living in Denial. She shows that fact, the association of apathy with greed or lack of concern, reflects the widespread social and often sociological assumption regarding why people are not responding, which she seeks to problematize. Apathy is shown by the lack of response, okay? We don't respond, we don't answer. We see things, but we don't do anything. I would say that we are members of an exhausted capitalist culture that does not enable us to take action, even if we see the issue. Norgaard thinks that the problem is kept at a distance by the media. I'm not sure. We see fires, we see catastrophes all the time. Perhaps it was true when she did the research in Norway 15 years ago. It was about a very warm winter in Norway. But today it would be more difficult to claim. When she writes that the terms apathy and non-response are, I quote, used to describe the absence of the issue of global warming in conversation or politics, she may be mistaken. We don't stop talking about it, but we don't make a link between the situation and the necessity to do something. Nothing is hidden to us, as the phenomenon is so spectacular. Thus, the evidence of the problem has no consequences. The first explanation, it appears in Norgaard's book. Two, but I want to unpack it, is the following. There is a huge gap between the causes of catastrophes and their effects. It can take many centuries for damage to appear. The first stages of environmental damage are characterized by their long invisibility. The second issue is a multi-factor dimension of this phenomena. Let's have a look at the significant increase of cancers, particularly among younger generations. Can we blame it on pesticides, air pollution, obesity, use of recreational drugs, and so on and so forth? Activists tend to focus on one. They are most of the time monothematic. Okay? My sister-in-law is obsessed by pesticides, but she drives a diesel car. Their enemies will answer that there is no statistical evidence to support their claim, and it's true. As there is never sufficient evidence for a single factor, it is likely that we will not address any one. The ostrich politics imply that we are not unaware of the problem. We choose to ignore it, as mobilizing resources to solve it would be too costly in negotiations with others, in personal renunciation, in the tranquility of life. Stanley Cohen has documented this long ago in States of Denial. Cohen highlighted the importance of ambiguity. Denial operates in the slippage zone between knowing and not knowing. I quote him, "We are vaguely aware of choosing not to look at the fact, but not quite conscious of just what it is that we are evading. We know, but at the same time, we don't know," end of quote. He contends that denial is always partial. Some information is always registered. This paradox of doubleness, knowing and not knowing, is the heart of the concept. Norgaard shows that everyday life is too busy to allow people to envisage some type of action. I quote her again. Here, as Eric, one of the citizens in the Norway village, struggled with how to understand why others in the community were not doing more on the issue of climate change. He referred to the fact that people do lead busy lives and have to choose what to be engaged with. I would add, it may be seen as a bounty, as it is noted in the book, to have mushrooms for Christmas dinner, cornucopia again. Denial is consubstantial to social life. We decide to close our eyes on many things. This accounts for the silence concerning sexual abuse within the family. An eye-opening would be too costly for the family order that official morality commands to preserve. And we know that very, very clearly. There are, of course, other explanations to apathy and denial. As the voting process, the change of attitude of any individual is too minimal to have any significant effect. Is it a rational choice for me to vote, since I know that voting or not will not change the outcome? It is the same for environment. My good conduct, selling my car, riding a bicycle, dumping my barbecue and my air conditioning system, not coming to São Paulo for the Congress, would not change anything to the situation. Big changes are left to the state or to big organizations. Individual lives do not matter. Additionally, some people can see advantages in global warming. Resorts in the North Sea and the Manche and the Baltic are considered as excellent alternatives to the Mediterranean. Real estate prices are soaring. The melting of the ice cap offers new economic opportunities for international commerce and so on. Very often, a form of cost-advantage reasoning is used by actors. For sure, there will be dramatic flooding in coastal areas and many dead, but there will be prosperity for new areas. Capitalism is resilient. It has no morality, but an inexhausted genius for innovation. The last point I want to mention here is environmental justice. The North and the West have benefited from the expansion of capitalism. The South has been dispossessed. Nobody could raise moral objections to the fact that the global South, whatever it is, now deserves development at the expense of the advantaged North. However, environmental justice is very difficult to enforce, and nobody would imagine the huge price of renunciation. Chakrabarty's example of Indians getting air conditioners and seeing their lives much improved is a case in point. Here, a technology is crucial to the minimal well-being of citizens. The contribution of a technology that permits the decent lives of people to global warming is always more important than its atmospheric consequences if we are oriented by social justice. And now, my conclusion. Dipesh Chakrabarty helped us provincialize Europe, but in his book, The Climate of History, he seems to be calling for a new kind of universalism. Climate change poses for us the question of a human collectivity, pointing toward a figure of the universal that escapes our capacity to experience the world. Fighting for environmental justice will be a long endeavor, but we can all agree on its significance. The urgent need is restoring the commons, but not at a local level, at the planetary one, which is awfully difficult, knowing that the idea of a world institution that would care for reinstalled planetary commons is, up to now, a fancy. Now, and maybe tomorrow, look at the very good idea of a world system of taxation proposed by Piketty and others. it was instantly mocked. It's absurd. It's anti-economic, it will never work, and so on. And my second point, knowing that a minority avant-garde à la Lenin taking global power may charm intellectuals and may charm us, but it can't work on a planetary scale, even in a big crisis of capitalism. In Commonwealth, Hart and Negri argue that political modernity is based on property. This can't be contested. I quote them, and I pay tribute to Tony Negri, who was a great man. Mensch. The concept of property and the defense of property remain the foundation of every modern political constitution. It is in this sense that the republic, from the great bourgeois revolutions to the present day, is a republic of property. End of quote. Capitalism, mainly through biopolitics, appropriates the languages we create, the social practices we establish, the modes of sociality that define our relationships. Social agents never cease to produce meanings and symbols, but these are in turn appropriated by capital and radically transformed by power. This goes far beyond the usual view of the accumulation of cultural premiums or the predatory gaze on primitive culture, but identifies as a much more important process. All social practice is disrupted and transformed into an adjunct of capitalism. It should be noted that the authors consider identity politics to be a powerful weapon against capitalist appropriation. This, in my view, is debatable, of course, but I will not enter the debate. 25 years ago, Boltanski and Capello in The New Spirit of Capitalism showed that the new spirit of capitalism was talented enough to swallow artists' criticism, even the most radical, and digest it as a new asset for generating increased profit and more subtle class distinction. It seems that identity claims are now fairly well accepted by the market. The notion of the tragedy of the commons has been overused in economics. You remember giving free access to resources, initially grazing on unappropriated land leads to their depletion because agents give priority to self-interest. Conclusion, either enclosures or state regulation are needed. Karl Polanyi wrote that enclosures appeared as a revolution of the rich against the poor in the Great Transformation. More recently, some economists have attempted to reconsider the overly simplistic story of overgrazing. Elinor Ostrom even won the Nobel Prize by showing in Governing the Commons that the regulation of uses could be achieved without privatization or state control, but through local coordination. As a child, and this is a personal example, and José Vicente asked me to talk about Corsica. As a child, I used to observe a very sophisticated irrigation system in my Mediterranean village, where water was scarce. The villagers watered their vegetable gardens and orchards, starting at dawn in the upper part of the village, which is very steep, in the mountain, and working their way downwards toward 9 a.m. before the sun became too strong. They used free water from a small river, diverting its course towards their garden with thick rolls of cloth. They did this in perfect order. The name is torce l'acqua, okay, to divert the water. The few people who tried to cheat or use more water were immediately reprimanded. The order came from the local community, and the coordination was like in Ostrom's example, totally local. Much later, I saw the same system at work in Africa. This, of course, presupposes an egalitarian community and no incentive or even possibility to accumulate capital. It's no coincidence that my region was called a terra di comune, the land of the commons, as opposed to the neighboring region, terra di signori, the land of the lords. Here, the commons imply equality, mutual recognition, and collective interest in the rational use of limited resources. Above all, it's about the impossibility of accumulation. In the conclusion to his great book, Polanyi wrote, "To remove lands from the markets is synonymous with the incorporation of land with definite institutions such as the homestead, the factory, the township, the church, parks, wildlife preserves, and so on." The question is now, how can we resurrect the idea of the commons at a planetary level? The long history of capitalism has erased most of the non-propertied pieces of land on the globe. A few exceptions remain. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro considers as an anthropologist that the big stake now is the accessibility by non-modern collectives to ontological self-determination at the end of a process of decolonization of thought. The self-determination leads to the dignification of animism, or he calls it also perspectivism, which is very, very interesting. However, Viveiros de Castro ignores himself, he is totally honest with it, whether or not the emancipation of animism will guarantee social concord, and he adds that we can't wait a possible conversion to animism to answer the ecological imperative, as the countdown has started for a long time. I must conclude that the idea is extremely interesting, provocative, and stimulating, as it allows us to reconnect with nature as a process, as an ecosystem, but we ignore, to speak frankly, its feasibility. Apparently more oriented toward mobilization, the memo published a little bit before his death by Bruno Latour and Nikolai Schulz is an encouragement to envisage a more efficient form of political action, which means an agenda and a horizon. Against Latour's previous theologico-political statements, the very short book is driven by the need for efficiency. Surprisingly enough, the concept of class is revisited, but not really in the Marxian sense. The authors want to, I quote them, simplify and unify mobilizations in order to scale up the frame of social movement. But what exactly an ecological class is, if it's not based on the relation of production, but what seems to be a common awareness of the upcoming disaster? The memo is too short to give an answer. Previous environmental mobilizations that I studied, especially international and intercontinental, albeit very spectacular, have changed things only at the local level, and the planetary answer is hard to imagine here and now. Nevertheless, it gives us a political horizon that implies a form of consensus, at least among the ecological class. How would it be produced? By a common rejection of productivism, it seems. I see some Polanyiist overtones in the memo. The common goal is a partial decommodification of the world by returning to a common earth where all the people who suffer as workers, but also as consumers from productivism, unite. In many ways, we can consider that Latour's move is a move to a more standard leftist agenda, as we are forced to take action as it is only a condition for our own survival. If we take seriously the idea of ecological class, should the post-colonial distinction between lumpers and splitters, okay? So people who want to have a single frame to account for the history of the world, and the splitters, people who, on the contrary, and methodologically want to have multiple takes on the issue, how this distinction can survive. Chakrabarty himself, who has been a great splitter, as he acknowledges, he recognizes that the Anthropocene forces us to put up the global histories of capital in conversation with the history of human beings as a species, one species. This conversation must lead to probe the limit of historical understanding. The undoubtedly implies a revision of the human ambition in the form of a Copernican revolution. We are no longer at the center of nature, and Europe is no longer at the center of the world. We know that. Modern capitalism has, and I want to conclude on this because I think it's the most important. Modern capitalism has generalized a probabilistic vision of the natural and the social world. Risk can be measured and assessed. My first directed book, a big book, was published almost 40 years ago. The title was The Vulnerable Society, and which évaluer et maîtriser les risques, assess and master the risks. But this is still a sort of modern standpoint on the minimization of the risk. So modern capitalism has generated this probabilistic vision. Risk can be measured and assessed, I told you. This is the origin of the insurance system, the statistics, and more generally, after the statistics, the social sciences. We may leave, in the modern view, we may leave a part of the risk aside if it does not threaten the outcome. Omelettes are not made without breaking eggs. The French Revolution, so the epitome of enlightenment, so to speak, has represented a turn in the management of risk, as two colleagues, Jarige and Leroux, show in their beautiful book, La contamination du monde, the contamination of the world. The new men, the revolutionary people said, the interest of the national industry is worth the sacrifice of some individuals, which in pre-modern societies was unthinkable. Now, a huge level of uncertainty makes the management of risk, as we considered it since the 19th century, in the modern perspective, clearly impossible. But this does not mean, as Bruno Latour seemed to believe, that we had to get rid of reason. On the contrary, we need reason more than in the past. Chakrabarty says, it's not me, this is true. The task now is to reconcile the imperative of reason with Viveiros de Castro's ontological perspectivism. Nous avons du pain sur la planche. We have plenty of work ahead of us. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, professor Fabiani. Teremos tempo, quiçá, para 4 ou 5 perguntas. Creio que haverá um microfone, senão aqui há. Alguma pergunta? Algum contra-ecologista que queira se manifestar? Por favor. Classe média.
I would actually just like to point something out that from one of the last phrases you said. You mentioned that in a pre-modern society or pre-modern world, you didn't have this idea of sacrificing some people for the risk or something like that. But it seems like a great contradiction since Europe promoted slavery like all over the world. So that's one thing. And another thing that I was thinking about during the conference was that it really caught my attention that a Norwegian author would talk about apathy and denial, because I don't know, we are having different struggles, very, very lively social movements in whole of Latin America, Asia, Africa. They are directly connected to the resources we need to live. And this goes from urban areas where you have people fighting for the right to have safe places to live, the right to have a right of their own bodies when they get pregnant, when they have kids, what resources they have to do with that or not. And also indigenous movements and everything. So it's really, it really caught my attention on how often, and still in 2025, it seems that many European authors are, having a hard time to look at what's going on beyond Europe. And at the same time, I wonder, and that's my question to you, whether we have this, projected idea of what fighting against climate change is, and then this makes it difficult for us to look at what is actually happening, what the, struggles against climate change, the shape they're taking in real life by the people who are most, affected by them. That's my question.
Okay. The big problem, that's your problem with me. You are right. But okay, I was very pleased to be invited, and I said yes. And of course, what do you think? When you say that the problem with activism is that we do not care about the real history. Europe promoted slavery. Is it too short? Okay, slavery existed before Europe and will exist maybe after Europe. So it's very difficult. Okay, second, the success of indigenous mobilizations. I have taught for 40 years social movements and especially environment movements, okay? And I respect indigenous movements, but I mean, what I see when I travel and when I see my friends in Africa is that the most disadvantaged people suffer the most, okay, because they cannot protect themselves, okay? Whatever the people of the middle class praise in indigenous movements, they continue to die. And in Togo, for instance, I have seen that recently, okay? It's impossible to do any agriculture. So what is the benefit of this? In universities, yes, you can make profit of militantism. But elsewhere, it does not work that much. So that's the question. People continue to die, and they will have to leave their countries by millions, maybe by billions. And the question is, okay, that's not, I can die. I can die in front of you as a European. I can commit suicide, seppuku. It will not change anything, okay? Europe does not exist. We are, we are drowning, okay? China is much more important, okay? So that's the point. I recognize I've worked on indigenous struggles very often, but this is another scale, okay? And the coordination, what I wanted to say as a poor European, but I think that everybody has the right to speak, because my grandfather was a working class man, okay? And I am not a capitalist, I am no slave. My ancestors were slaves in the Roman Empire. Do you know that? I will not be proud of this, okay? I don't give a damn. But, okay, we have to be honest with ourselves, okay? European or not. You can kill me, you can make me disappear. It will not change the reality that the earth is burning, okay? That's a problem. I don't give a damn if you blame me, because I'm not responsible, okay? I am a family of agricultures, working class, so I don't care about insulting Europe. It's a sort of easy trick, okay? And what I want to say to other people, and this sort of cohesion of countries that are developing in many different ways. It's not serious what is said all over the place about, okay. So I think that you have to consider this and not saying that, okay, this guy can be, his head can roll on the, in the guillotine, okay? So blaming myself to be sympathetic to you, this is something that I cannot do.
Please, another question.
I'm sorry about this.
Hi, first, Professor, I would like to thank you for your presentation and to be here to talk with us. My name is Fabio. I'm a doctoral student here at the University of São Paulo. My question is about one term that you use about the conservative thinking. That conservative thinking try to restore something. And my idea of conservative is that don't touch anything. Stay as that are, that is. And I would like to ask, do you think that the conservative think really about restoring something that was good in the past and is not now?
Thank you very much. It's a very important question. I've worked in the past on what we call the restoration of nature. So the recreation, I have a long article on the recreation of nature. So the recreation of nature is about creating artifacts that allow us to think that we have come back to a previous state of the ecosystems, okay? But this procedure requires a lot of artifacts, okay? And in my article, I showed how a wet zone in the southwestern part of France was I would say re-humidified, but they needed electric pumps to keep the same level of the water in the previous wet zone. So conserving or recreating has a technical cost. So, but I want to come now to your conservation, of course, is not reaction. Reactionary want to go to a previous state, previous than the one that exists. The conservative wants to conserve what is around. So I think that, of course, that's why I don't blame Bruno Latour for its conservative vision, because conservative is to protect what is left, okay? But of course, it goes against our vision. That's why I wanted to document our vision. I was educated in a very leftist time, and we thought that the emancipation of the world was a necessity, okay? And not at the expense of some, but for all the world, okay? This Marxian universalism. And of course, in Latour's model, conservation requires that we abandon the false idea of emancipation and in some way self-control, okay? Because of course he's right in saying that self-control has led to a lack of control of the capitalism destroying nature. So I think that we have to think. I have no conclusion and no lesson. I'm very humble. But the real question, and I say that to Latour many times, is how we can, okay, keep something that is reason against, of course, the destruction of reason in the last 2 centuries. That's the question, of course, and that's why conservatism may be acceptable at a certain level. Thank you.
Bom, creio então vamos uma última question, the last one.
Hello, good afternoon, Professor. My name is Julia. I'm a PhD student in Minas Gerais, and I work with my thesis is on cooperation strategies on mining. And I would like to ask you about how you view and how is the debate in France and Europe on how especially mining corporations work with the idea of climate change as kind of a new deal, a new way to see profits and to see new lands to seek and to work with when it comes to the strategic minerals and mining for the energetic transitions. and how it creates sacrifice zones here in the South, in Brazil, in Africa, and in the way that this extractivism, this natural, unsustainable sector is trying to keep and to bring to itself this discourse about climate change and about energetic transition and environmental justice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very important point. Okay, here I will bring in the concept of extractivism, because, and the first question was right in this. Okay, what happened, of course, and it was centered around Britain at the beginning, but it was the extraction, of course, by dispossession of the dominated world in order to get its resources. But of course, the coal, okay, mining was very important and the source of the development of capitalism in Britain. And the question is how so it's really here, and I agree with the first question too. The issue is the self-determination of people, of course, in their choices. And how to, and this was a part, maybe it was overlooked because I was too quick, but the question is, the North and the West do not have anything to say about mining in other countries. This is something that belongs to the people now. But I think, of course, that it's very difficult to produce a sort of international consensus on the question of fossil energies. And because, of course, we have this symmetry between the developed world and the developing world. It lacks nuances, but that's what I think. People have to determine themselves in their own countries about what is to be done, especially with fossil energies and the ecological transition. What I can see from Europe and the United States, that the energy transition does not exist really, okay? In China, solar energy is now the most important of the world, but Donald Trump would not consider it. So I think these things are game changers, and we have to. But what concerns me the most is the fact that agriculture becomes impossible in vast zones of Africa. Okay, and this for me is the most urgent thing to do. And of course, they have also to rely on their own forces, which are, due to this historical domination, very scarce. Okay.
A última pergunta, por gentileza.
So, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Tatiana. I am actually a school teacher. We teach social sciences here in Brazil at high school students. It's compulsory. Sociology is compulsory. And when I was studying a master's and PhD, I really loved to have contact with social theory. And I really appreciate the way you connect many different authors of social theory. That was really nice. I am curious to hear about the curriculum, the sociology curriculum in universities in Europe. I see you have a considerable, large experience in the university field as a professor. I'm curious to know how this topic related to the huge risks of environment are being taught as a main subject in Europe. Here in Brazil recently, we have a huge change, and latest 5 years maybe, at the least, maybe 5 or 10 years, we have this as a very important topic in many universities, not only in social sciences. How is it going in Europe now?
Okay, my answer will be very partial because there are many differences, I think, in curricula in Europe today. What I can say is that curricula on environment appeared sort of late compared to the environmental crisis. And we had curricula only in the end of the 20th century, 25 years ago, so to speak. And we tried to, and I imagine it's the same in Brazil, to overcome the disciplinary boundaries. So in the 70s, I worked with biologists. I was the first to do that in France about the problems of what we call urban forest, okay, in the Fontainebleau or in Versailles, and the problem of acid rains. And we try to create protocols of research associating biologists and sociologists or historians. So environmental history is now very important, and I clipped a few things about the revolution and so on. It's a very rich field, but what we do, of course, is reintroducing human activities in what we call eco-complex, in a complex of ecosystems, and try to historicize the analysis of the biosphere. And we, of course, mix social movements with ecological analysis of the situation. We are very attentive to indigenous movement, mobilization, indigenous experience. I said that in my presentation. We are also analyzing the very difficult internationalization of social movements about these issues. And if you give me your email, I will send you my own course, Environment and Climate Change, and also my course on social theory, because of course the question I raised and I answered a little bit maybe too violently. The question is how to de-Europeanize ourselves, okay? We can also say that, okay, you have won, okay? But I don't. I think we have to make a lot of profit about this. I'm a great fan of Chakrabarty and others. So what we have to take into account is the experience of other people, and that's why I quoted Viveros de Castro, because I think it's important to de-center the analysis. So we tried, in my curriculum, I tried to decenter the analysis and give, of course, the floor to others. This is what I can say for the time being, but I can send you, it's very difficult to decolonize the curriculum. I tried, but it's very complex. I give you an example. Okay? I know he wants to me to close, but one example which I found very, very interesting. So I tried to, I have a sort of introduction. It's an introduction for masters, so great thinkers. So I used to start with Thomas Hobbes, okay, about property, violence, the social covenant, and so on. And I said, no, I have to begin with the man I believed was the first sociologist. So it's a sincere belief. Ibn Khaldun, who was from the Muslim thinker, geographer, and scholar in the 14th century, born in Tunisia, Kairouan. So I've been a fan of his works for long, because he's the first to introduce, you know, the division between the nomad and the urban people and so on, and create, okay, from geography. But what happened? When I started with Ibn Khaldun, a student told me, you can't talk about Ibn Khaldun because you are not a Muslim. That's my big problem that I wanted to illustrate by my answer. So if only Muslims can talk about Ibn Khaldun. Only Catholics can talk about Bruno Latour. This, for me, is stupid, okay? And even if I blame myself, which is absurd, okay? You will not convince any European that she or he has responsibility, because most of the people were poor peasants or workers. So say, if you have dominated the world, you were the kings. And no, we have to be a little bit more subtle, okay? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Fabiani, for this wonderful conference and discussion. Thank you very much indeed in the name of the Brazilian Society of Sociology. Thank you for everybody here.
Derrière, c'est où?